Hi there, Social Studies 30-1 here, looking at our third source of the week. We're looking at another set of illiberalism sources. These ones were called Part 2. Cartoon today. So I'll give you a few seconds to examine a cartoon, then we will take it apart. All right, I think you're probably ready. I hope you're ready. When I first looked at the cartoon, when I first saw this, my reaction was to look at the image itself. Looks like a mother sitting on her chair reading, talking to her daughter who's got some kind of a toy or a doll. A woman is endowed with certain inalienable rights, all of which she must fight for. So to be endowed with something means that you have something, you are gifted with something. Inalienable would mean that you just have them. You have them just for being you. You have them for being a person. You have them upon birth. They're natural. They can't be taken away. You don't need to earn them. And so the great irony in what is being said is that a woman is endowed with certain inalienable rights, all of which she must fight for. You shouldn't have to fight for inalienable rights. You have them and they can't be taken away. And so that is the great irony that you need to uncover in the source. So what I would do is I would list some of the inalienable rights that you think they're referring to. So obviously rights of equality, the right to vote, maybe the right to run for public office, to run in elections, the right to fair pay and treatment in the workplace, the right to equal promotion in the workplace. Those would all be the inalienable rights that women have just for being people, like anyone does. And then the great irony is that, to get these rights, she's saying that you still have to fight for them. I found it interesting. This cartoon was published in 2009 because that wasn't that long ago. I mean, that was just a little over 10 years ago now. So it's not like we're talking about the early 1900s or even the 1950s and 60s where, women clearly weren't treated as equal to men in a lot of workplaces and politics and so on. And then certainly, 19 and 1800s, women in a lot of places weren't even considered citizens. They couldn't vote. They didn't have any of those rights. So it's just highly ironic and surprising that this would be happening in 2009. And again, you shouldn't have to fight for something that is inalienable. You have them. And so what you need to expand on now and speculate on a bit is that, in what areas do women still not have rights? And what I think they mean by that is that in what areas are women still not equal to men? In what areas are women still not equal in representation to men? So, of course, probably the workplace. By and large, women are still underrepresented in management positions and things like that. In terms of wage comparison, women on average still make less than men, even though they might be doing the same job as men. And finally, women are still largely underrepresented in public office, in the House of Commons, in the American Senate and Congress. Women by far are still underrepresented when compared to men in those roles. And that's what the cartoonist is hitting at, and that even though women's rights were gained in the early 1900s, women still don't really have them in a lot of areas. It's one thing to have something on paper, but to have those rights and have them put into action is a different story altogether. So it would have helped if you had read and highlighted the article entitled Women's Suffrage in Canada. That would help you attach dates and certain events to the cartoon. It would really enhance your understanding of the cartoon. When we look at our links, well, we're seeing, of course, individual rights and freedoms, and probably the self-interest of women is secondary in some ways when compared to men. They're still fighting for a lot of the things that, that men might take for granted. Finally, your perspective for the source here is someone who is challenging liberalism, pointing out the hypocritical nature of liberalism and that even though that it says that women are equal to men, it doesn't always translate to them being equal to men. And that is a critique of liberalism. It's challenging liberalism. It's pointing out the hypocrisy behind liberalism. You shouldn't have to fight for something that you have upon birth as a citizen in Canada, or any democracy for that matter. Can't think of anything else you'd want to point out for the source. Again, 2009 is important. That's supposed to be shocking. You wouldn't think this kind of a scene would be happening in 2009, but I guess it does in some ways. Good job with that. Hope you got something out of that source. While we're at it, let's link them together. Source one was a speech, of course, by Lyndon Johnson, who was just talking about how, as far as America has come, there's still a long way to go. He refers to poverty and racial injustice. In other words, this is in the midst of the American Civil Rights Movement. This speech would be a reaction to the Jim Crow laws, which basically segregated black people from white people in the southern states, and prevented them from voting in elections as well. Source two is talking about Canada and illiberalism in Canada. This one was specific to eugenics and the residential school system, but you could certainly refer to internment of the Japanese and Ukrainian Canadians. And then, of course, here's our third source for the day, the cartoon. So what we do now, of course, is we link them together. So you could pick as your link illiberalism. It could be as simple and as general as that. But all three sources are speculating and advocating for different degrees of liberalism. Source one is in the midst of advocating for liberalism in America to bring black people into the political fold, to let them vote, run for office, and so on. Source two is kind of looking back on past illiberalist measures in Canada and calling for more action from the government to make sure that they don't happen again. And finally, source three is kind of again present day. As far as Canada's come, there are still elements of illiberalism in Canada in terms of equality rights between men and women. So that could be a link. And again, you pick your concept, you link each source to the concept, and then what you could also do is there's a bit of a time frame that's been established too. Source one clearly comes first. It's going on right in the midst of the liberalist measure. Source three, much the same. It's going on in the midst of a liberalism in Canadian democracy. And then finally, maybe source two is a reaction to the liberalism found in itself and the other two sources. The government needs to do more to make sure this doesn't happen again. They must account for it, take responsibility for it to make sure those actions are never repeated. And that's probably as much as you need to do with your relationships. Good job with that.